They say the lantern guides the lost, but here...
The granite walls absorbed my breathing like they'd been waiting for someone to fill the silence. I stood in what used to be the main hall, dust particles dancing through cracks in the roof, and realized I might never leave this place. My hiking boots left prints across stone floors that hadn't seen footsteps in probably 40 years. The radio in my pack crackled with words I kept trying to unhear: outbreak, containment failure, avoid populated areas. I was a social worker from Denver, 3 days into what was supposed to be a 2-week solo trek through the San Juan Mountains, and I just stumbled into a structure that maps forgot to mention. The discovery happened by accident. I'd been following an old hunting trail that narrowed into nothing, forcing me to bushwhack through pine stands so thick the afternoon light turned green. Then the trees opened up, and there it was, this massive stone building clinging to the mountainside like it grew from the rock itself. No roads leading to it, no signs of recent human activity, just weathered stone, a bell tower missing its bell, and windows that stared down the valley like tired eyes. The architecture was simple but solid. Thick walls, a slate roof mostly intact, and a layout that suggested whoever built this understood isolation. I spent the first hour exploring, my headlamp cutting through rooms filled with broken furniture and bird nests. The place was bigger than it looked from outside, a main hall with a vaulted ceiling that made my footsteps echo like whispers, smaller rooms branching off a central corridor, each one a mystery of what it once held. A kitchen area with a stone hearth large enough to stand in, blackened by centuries of fires. Below that, a cellar carved straight into the mountain, cool and dry with stone shelves built into the walls. Out back, I found terraced gardens overgrown with wild vegetation, raspberry canes thick as my wrist, gone-to-seed lettuce tall as my chest, rhubarb plants spreading like weeds across an entire terrace. A spring bubbled from the rocks above, feeding into a stone basin someone had built a century ago. The water ran clear and cold, draining into a channel that disappeared downslope. That's when the radio squawked again. This time, the voice belonged to a park ranger I'd checked in with 3 days prior, a guy named Mitchell who'd given me trail conditions and weather forecasts. His words came fast and jagged, nothing like the calm professional I'd spoken with before. Anyone monitoring this frequency, this is Ranger Station 7. Situation has deteriorated beyond all protocols. The outbreak is not contained. I repeat, not contained. We've lost contact with every station below 5,000 feet. If you're in the backcountry, stay there. Do not attempt to return to populated areas. Do not trust official evacuation routes. This is my last transmission. Good luck. Static swallowed everything after that, just empty hiss that somehow sounded louder than his voice had been. I sat on the stone steps of the monastery, watching dusk paint the valley purple and gold, and made a decision that felt both insane and obvious. I wasn't going back down. Everything I needed was right here: water, potential food sources, shelter with walls thick enough to outlast whatever chaos was unfolding in the towns below. I had basic supplies: a water filter, fire starter, a good knife, freeze-dried meals to last 2 weeks if I stretched them, a first aid kit that seemed pathetically inadequate for any real emergency, rope, a tarp, extra socks, the essentials for 2 weeks in the wilderness, which suddenly had to become the essentials for indefinite survival. But more than that, I had something the people trapped in cities didn't: distance and defensibility. The monastery sat at nearly 9,000 feet, accessible only by trails that would be invisible under the first heavy snow. No roads meant no vehicle traffic, no desperate crowds, no way for chaos to drive right up to the door. The valley below was visible for miles in 3 directions, providing early warning of anyone approaching. And those walls, those beautiful thick stone walls, represented safety in a way my apartment in Denver never had. I pulled out my radio again and cycled through channels, listening to fragments of the world ending. A news broadcast, probably automated, listed cities under quarantine. An emergency alert system repeated instructions to shelter in place and await military assistance. A ham radio operator somewhere was calling for anyone at all, to respond with information from the eastern seaboard. Static consumed most frequencies. The silence between transmissions felt heavier than the messages themselves. The sun dropped behind the western peaks, and temperature plummeted the way it does at elevation. I gathered my gear and moved inside, choosing one of the smaller rooms off the main hall for my first night. The space was maybe 10 feet square, with a window facing east and stone walls that held the day's warmth for a few precious hours after sunset. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor, swept clear of decades of debris, and ate half a freeze-dried meal while my camping stove hissed in the corner. If you've ever stood at a crossroads where both paths looked wrong and you had to choose anyway, you know the feeling that settled in my chest that night. Every instinct said I should try to get back to civilization, check on friends and colleagues, help with the crisis response. But another voice, the one that had kept me alive through 7 years of crisis intervention work in some of Denver's worst neighborhoods, said staying was the only choice that made sense. Stay with me, because what happened next turned this abandoned place into something neither of us could predict. Like and subscribe, because this story only gets stranger from here. The first week was pure survival logistics mixed with the strange meditation of manual labor. I woke with the sun, not because I wanted to, but because the cold drove me from my sleeping bag. My breath fogged inside the room until I got a fire going in the main hall's hearth. That first successful fire felt like winning a lottery. I'd cleared the flue the previous evening, poking blindly up the chimney with a long branch, and wasn't sure it would actually draw. When smoke rose steadily instead of billowing back into the room, I actually laughed out loud, the sound echoing off stone in a way that made me aware of how alone I was. I cleared the main hall of debris, a task that sounds simple but took 2 full days. Centuries of pine needles had blown in through broken windows and the gaps in the door. Bird droppings covered every horizontal surface in white streaks. Small animal bones suggested owls or hawks had used the space as a hunting ground. I swept and hauled, creating a pile outside that would eventually become compost for the gardens. My back ached from the repetitive motion, my hands blistered despite my gloves, but the physical exhaustion kept my mind from spiraling into anxiety about the world I'd left behind. The windows needed attention next. Most still had glass, surprisingly, though 2 were completely broken out. I couldn't replace glass, but I could cover the openings with my tarp, sacrificing my shelter for the building's shelter. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was literally putting down roots in a place I'd discovered 4 days ago, committing to it in ways I'd never committed to anything in my life. My apartment in Denver had remained half unpacked for the 2 years I'd lived there, always temporary in my mind. This place, this abandoned stone structure on a mountain, was becoming permanent before I'd made a conscious decision to let it. The gardens became my obsession and my salvation. Someone who lived here decades ago had understood permaculture before it had a trendy name. The terraces followed the natural slope, each one about 4 feet lower than the one above it, capturing runoff from the spring. Wild strawberries carpeted the lowest terrace, their runners spreading in every direction. Another terrace had gone entirely to mint, the smell so strong it cleared my sinuses when I walked through. I found potato plants that had been self-seeding for who knows how long, their tubers small but edible when I dug carefully with my knife. The raspberry canes dominated 2 terraces, their thorny branches creating an almost impenetrable thicket, but underneath, if you pushed through carefully, were berries. Small, intensely tart, nothing like the plump domesticated ones from grocery stores, but edible and abundant. I ate handfuls while I worked, the juice staining my fingers purple and the seeds catching in my teeth. It was the first food that didn't come from my dwindling supply bags, and it tasted like hope. I found other things too, evidence of the people who'd lived here before. Rusted garden tools in the kitchen building, a hoe with most of its handle rotted away, a rake that fell apart when I picked it up, but also a scythe, its blade rusty but the metal still solid underneath. I spent an afternoon removing rust with stones and water, then sharpening the blade against a whetstone I found in the cellar. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone became a meditation, my mind emptying of everything except the angle of the blade and the feel of the edge developing. I rationed my freeze-dried meals, eating 1/2 portion per day while I foraged and learned what grew around me. Dandelion greens, though bitter enough to make my face contort, filled my stomach and provided nutrients my body craved. I dug up the potatoes carefully, replanting the smallest ones for next year's crop, eating the larger ones roasted in the coals of my fire. The rhubarb became a staple. I'd chop the stalks and boil them into a sour mash that didn't taste good but provided bulk and vitamin C. There were wild onions near the spring, their smell unmistakable when I accidentally crushed one with my boot, and I found a patch of wood sorrel that added a lemony bite to my foraged salads. The spring itself was a miracle I didn't take for granted. Clear water bubbled from a crack in the rocks about 20 feet above the monastery, flowing into the stone basin before continuing downslope. I tested it carefully, running it through my filter despite how clean it looked, drinking small amounts and waiting for my stomach to rebel. When nothing happened after 24 hours, I stopped filtering. The water was cold enough to hurt my teeth, tasted faintly mineral, and became the anchor point of my daily routine. Morning, fill water containers. Afternoon, fill water containers for cooking in the next day. The radio kept talking for the first 5 days, then went silent except for occasional automated emergency broadcasts. The messages repeated with the kind of consistency that suggested no human was updating them anymore. Shelter in place, avoid contact with infected individuals, martial law in effect in major metropolitan areas, await further instructions. On day 6, I heard a human voice again, just fragments between static bursts. A man talking fast and scared about Chicago burning, about Atlanta gone dark, about how fast everything fell apart when supply chains collapsed and people realized the government had no plan for collapse at this scale. I stopped listening after that. The radio went into a drawer in one of the small rooms I'd converted into a sleeping space. I focused instead on making this place livable, channeling every bit of my social work training into creating structure when everything else lacked it. Routine became my anchor. Wake at dawn, start the fire, eat a small breakfast, work the gardens until mid-morning, focus on building repairs until afternoon, forage until evening, eat dinner, sit by the fire and plan the next day, sleep. The rhythm kept me sane when the enormity of what was happening threatened to overwhelm me. I patched roof leaks using a combination of pine boughs and flat stones, wedging them into gaps where slates had slipped or broken. The work was precarious. I'm not great with heights, and the roof's pitch was steep enough to make every step feel potentially fatal. But water damage would destroy this place faster than anything else. So I forced myself up there, moving carefully, breathing through the fear, focusing on one patch at a time. I built a better door for the main entrance using wood from collapsed furniture. The original door was more gaps than wood, held together by rust and habit. I salvaged planks from a massive table that had fallen apart in one of the side rooms, the wood still solid despite years of exposure. Using rope and wedges, I constructed a door that actually sealed the entrance. It wasn't pretty, but it cut the cold wind that had been whistling through the main hall. The work kept my hands busy and my mind from spiraling into what-ifs about everyone I knew back in Denver. My mother in Florida, who I hadn't spoken to in 6 months after our last argument. My supervisor at the social services department, a woman named Carol who'd mentored me through my worst cases. The guys I played pickup basketball with on Thursday nights, whose names I suddenly couldn't remember clearly. The barista at the coffee shop near my office who always remembered I took my coffee black. All those connections that had felt solid suddenly seemed as insubstantial as smoke. Day 14 arrived with snow, early for the season, even at this elevation, but I watched it fall through the repaired windows and felt oddly grateful for the insulation it provided. Each flake was small and dry, the kind that squeaked underfoot, and they accumulated quickly. By noon, 3 inches covered the ground. By evening, 6 inches had transformed the monastery into something from a photograph, all softened edges and muffled sound. I'd gathered enough firewood to last months, stacking it in the covered walkway that connected the main hall to the kitchen building. My body had adapted to constant hunger, not starvation, but that hollow feeling of never quite eating enough. I'd lost weight, my pants held up with a belt I'd punched new holes in using my knife tip. My face, when I caught my reflection in the spring's basin, looked angular in ways it hadn't before, my cheekbones prominent and my eyes shadowed. That's when I heard the voices outside, two men arguing in harsh whispers that carried through the snow-muffled air. I grabbed my hiking staff, the closest thing to a weapon I had, and moved to a window. They stood near the spring, both carrying backpacks that looked military surplus, the kind you'd buy at an Army-Navy store. One was younger, maybe mid-20s, with a scraggly beard and wild eyes that darted constantly. The other was older, 50-something, moving with the careful deliberation of someone nursing an injury. He favored his left side, and even from a distance I could see the tightness in his face that spoke of pain being managed rather than healed. They hadn't seen me yet. I watched them drink from the spring, the younger one filling bottles while the older man kept glancing downslope like he expected something to follow them up. Their clothes were torn, stained with things I didn't want to identify. Mud, definitely, but also darker stains that could have been blood or something worse. Neither one looked infected. They moved too purposefully, spoke too clearly, maintained the kind of coordinated awareness that comes from functioning minds. But they looked haunted in a way I recognized from my years doing crisis intervention work. These were people who'd seen things that changed them, carried weights that wouldn't be easily set down. I made a choice then that would define everything that followed. Instead of hiding, instead of waiting to see what they'd do, I opened the main door and stepped out where they could see me. The snow crunched under my boots, and both men spun toward the sound. The younger one's hand went to his waistband. I kept my hands visible, the staff held loosely, non-threatening, using every bit of body language training I'd learned in crisis intervention. Keep your shoulders relaxed. Make yourself smaller. Show you're not a threat while also showing you're not prey. There's enough water for everyone, I said, my voice rough from 2 weeks of barely using it. You look like you've come a long way. The older man studied me with the kind of assessment that comes from having to judge threats quickly and accurately. His eyes moved from my face to my hands to my stance to the monastery behind me, calculating variables I could only guess at. Whatever he saw made him relax fractionally, his hand moving away from whatever he'd been reaching for. We didn't know anyone was here, he said, his voice carrying a Midwestern accent. Place looked abandoned from below. It was, I said. Not anymore. You running from something specific, or just the general situation? The younger man laughed, a sound without humor that echoed off the stone walls. The general situation. That's one way to put it. That's definitely one way to describe the complete collapse of civilization. His name was Marcus, and up close he looked younger than I'd initially thought. Maybe 23, 24, with the kind of lean build that came from always being active. The older man was Thomas, a former EMT from Grand Junction, who'd been visiting his daughter in a city he wouldn't name when everything went to hell. They'd met in a refugee camp that had turned violent, escaped together, and had been hiking for 8 days, moving mostly at night, avoiding roads and anywhere they saw smoke or heard engines, trusting nothing and no one until exhaustion forced them to take risks. Marcus had a gash on his calf that Thomas had been trying to keep clean, but infection was setting in despite his efforts. I could see the red streaks radiating from the wound when Thomas pulled up his pant leg to show me, could smell the faint sweet rot odor that meant bacteria was winning. They needed rest, medical supplies they didn't have, and most of all, they needed to stop running long enough for their bodies to remember how to heal. I took them inside and showed them what I'd built in 2 weeks. It wasn't much. Clean spaces, a working fire, food that would keep you alive if not satisfied. But their faces when they saw the main hall, when they felt the warmth from the hearth, when they realized the walls were solid stone and the water source was reliable, I saw hope flicker back to life in their expressions. That look, the one where someone who'd given up suddenly allows themselves to believe again, was one I'd seen countless times in my social work career. It never stopped being powerful. Thomas cleaned Marcus's wound properly once he had hot water and actual light to work by. The infection wasn't as bad as he'd feared. The red streaks were inflammation more than spreading infection, and the wound itself was relatively clean underneath the dirt and dried blood. He had basic supplies in his pack: antiseptic wipes, gauze, medical tape. I contributed my first aid kit, and together we patched Marcus up, while he sat stoically, not making a sound even when Thomas flushed the wound with hot water and Marcus's hands clenched into fists. I shared my extremely limited food supplies, and we talked through the night about what they'd seen, what they'd survived, and what might come next. Thomas had been in the city when the outbreak began, had seen the initial chaos as the infection spread faster than anyone could respond. He described hospitals overwhelmed within hours, emergency services collapsing as first responders became victims, the social order disintegrating as people realized the government had no plan for this scale of catastrophe. Marcus had been a college student studying environmental science at a university he wouldn't name. He'd been camping with friends when it started, had tried to return to campus, and had found it transformed into a nightmare he struggled to describe. His friends hadn't made it. That was all he'd say about them, his jaw clenching and his eyes going distant. "This place," Thomas said after I'd explained about the spring and the gardens and my plans for long-term sustainability, "feels different. Like the world's chaos hasn't reached it yet. Like maybe it won't." "That's exactly what I thought," I admitted. "I'm planning to keep it that way as long as possible." Marcus, his leg newly bandaged and the pain medication from Thomas's pack starting to work, asked the question that mattered. "You going to let us stay?" I'd been thinking about that since I heard their voices by the spring. 2 weeks of solitude had taught me I could survive alone, but it had also reminded me that humans aren't built for permanent isolation. We're social creatures, evolved for tribes and communities, and even my introverted personality was starting to feel the strain of no human contact. And more than that, my entire career had been about helping people in crisis, about creating spaces where the traumatized could find stability. If the world outside was eating itself alive, maybe I could build something here that ran on different rules. But I also had to be careful. Not everyone who survived would be someone you'd want to survive with. Trauma brings out the best and worst in people, sometimes simultaneously. I'd seen enough crisis situations to know that desperation could turn anyone dangerous, and trust had to be earned rather than given freely. I looked at Thomas, who'd used his medical skills to help a young man who wasn't family, who'd risked his own safety to guide Marcus to safety. I looked at Marcus, who, despite his obvious pain and exhaustion, had helped set up their camp by the spring before Thomas insisted they approach the monastery. These weren't predators looking for easy victims. They were survivors looking for refuge. "You can stay," I said, "but this isn't going to be some survival compound where we just hide and hoard resources and wait for the world to end. If we're doing this, we do it right. We build something worth surviving for, not just another fortress of fear." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding something in my words that Marcus was too tired to fully process. "What did you have in mind?" "I haven't figured out all the details," I admitted. "But I know this. The world outside fell apart because people stopped caring about anything except their own survival. Fear became the only currency. If we're building something here, it has to be based on different principles. Cooperation instead of competition. Compassion instead of callousness. We preserve not just our lives, but our humanity." Marcus laughed softly, not mocking but with a kind of desperate hope. "You're talking about building a utopia in the apocalypse." "I'm talking about building something functional," I corrected. "Utopias fail because they ignore human nature. I'm not ignoring it. I spent 7 years working with people at their absolute worst, their most desperate and broken. I know what humans are capable of. But I also know what we're capable of building when we try. And I'd rather die trying to build something good than survive by becoming something terrible." That was the beginning of what we'd become, though none of us fully understood it yet. Thomas fell asleep by the fire first, exhaustion finally overwhelming his medical training's insistence that he monitor Marcus's wound. Marcus lasted another hour before his eyes closed, his body surrendering to the first real safety he'd felt in weeks. I stayed awake, feeding the fire and thinking about what I'd just committed to. Building community was harder than surviving alone. I knew that from experience. Every person added complexity, conflict potential, resource strain, but every person also added skills, perspectives, strengths that could make all the difference between merely surviving and actually thriving. The question was whether I could build something that maximized the benefits while minimizing the risks. The snow fell steadily outside, adding another layer of insulation between us and the world below. In the morning, I'd show them the gardens, the cellar, the spring system, all the pieces of infrastructure I'd begun establishing. We'd figure out food rationing, work schedules, health protocols. We'd start the difficult process of becoming something more than three strangers sharing a fire. But for now, I let myself sit in the warmth, listening to two people breathe safely in sleep, and acknowledge that I was no longer alone. For better or worse, I'd just become responsible for more than my own survival. The first real test would come soon enough. Morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after fresh snow. The world outside looked new, dangerous edges softened under white blankets, and for a moment I could pretend everything was normal. Then Thomas sat up with a groan that spoke of a body pushed beyond reasonable limits, and Marcus muttered something in his sleep about running, and reality reasserted itself with familiar weight. I had the fire going and water heating before either of them fully woke. Thomas noticed first, his EMT training making him catalog details automatically: fire status, temperature, potential hazards, the general state of everyone present. He caught my eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of basic hospitality that felt more significant than it should have. "How's the leg?" I asked Marcus once he'd surfaced from whatever dreams plagued him. He flexed his calf experimentally, wincing but not crying out. "Better than yesterday. Still feels like someone took a hot poker to it, but better." Thomas checked the wound while I prepared what passed for breakfast, a thin porridge made from foraged grain seeds I'd found growing wild near the lower terrace, mixed with a handful of raspberries and some mint leaves for flavor. It wasn't much, divided 3 ways instead of 1, but we ate without complaint. Hunger was becoming a constant companion for all of us, something you acknowledged and worked around rather than something you could actually satisfy. "We need to talk about logistics," Thomas said once we'd finished eating. "If we're staying, and I think we should, this is the best situation either of us has seen in weeks. We need to establish some basic protocols." I appreciated his directness. Crisis situations don't leave room for dancing around difficult topics. "I'm listening." He outlined his concerns with the methodical approach of someone who'd spent years managing emergency situations. Food supplies were the most immediate issue. My foraged resources could sustain 1 person in a minimal way, but 3 people would deplete everything faster than it could regenerate unless we were extremely careful. Water wasn't a problem with the spring, but sanitation would become one if we didn't establish proper waste management. Medical supplies were almost non-existent, and winter was coming in earnest, which meant we needed more firewood than I'd stockpiled, and better insulation for the sleeping spaces. "There's also the security question," Marcus added, his voice quiet but firm. "You took a risk letting us approach. The next people might not be as harmless." "I know," I said, "but I'm not turning away everyone who shows up just because they might be dangerous. That's how you become the thing you're afraid of." Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "I'm not suggesting we become paranoid, but we need protocols for new arrivals. A quarantine period isn't just about disease, it's about observation. Give people time to show who they really are before integrating them into the core group." That made sense from both a medical and psychological perspective. I'd used similar approaches in transitional housing programs, creating buffer periods where new residents could adjust while staff assessed their needs and potential risks. 72 hours, I suggested. At minimum, Thomas agreed. One of the side rooms near the entrance could work, close enough to monitor, far enough to maintain separation if needed. We spent the morning establishing basic systems. Thomas took charge of what he called health and hygiene protocols, which sounded bureaucratic until he explained that disease would kill us faster than starvation in close quarters. He identified a spot downslope from the spring for waste disposal, far enough away that contamination wasn't a risk. He established hand-washing requirements before meals and after any outside work. Small things that would seem obvious in normal times, but required conscious enforcement when exhaustion and desperation made people careless. Marcus, despite his injured leg, insisted on seeing the gardens. I walked him through the terraces, showing him what I'd identified and what remained mysterious. His face lit up in ways it hadn't since his arrival. The transformation from haunted survivor to engaged expert was immediate and striking. "This is incredible," he said, kneeling carefully to examine the potato plants. "These have been self-seeding for years, probably decades. The genetic diversity here is probably better than anything you'd get from commercial seeds." He moved to the raspberry canes, pushing through them with practiced ease despite the thorns. "These need pruning badly, but the root system is extensive. We could triple production with proper management." "You know this stuff," I said, stating the obvious environmental science with a focus on sustainable agriculture, he said, not looking up from the plants. "I was planning to work in food security programs after graduation. Guess I'm getting practical experience earlier than expected." He spent 2 hours mapping the gardens despite Thomas's protests about his leg needing rest. Marcus was the kind of person who processed trauma through work. I recognized that pattern. Give him a task with clear parameters and visible results, and his mind could focus on something besides whatever memories haunted him. I'd seen it countless times in my social work career. People who couldn't talk about their pain but could channel it into productive action. By midday, we'd established a basic division of labor. Thomas would handle health medical concerns and anything requiring his EMT expertise. Marcus would manage food production and foraging, though he'd need to stay relatively immobile for another few days while his leg healed. I'd handle overall coordination, conflict resolution, and long-term planning, essentially continuing the social work role that had defined my professional life, just in a very different context. The afternoon brought our first real test. We were working on firewood processing, Marcus sitting and stripping bark while Thomas and I cut and split, when Thomas suddenly held up his hand for silence. We froze, and in the quiet I heard what his more experienced ears had caught first. Voices down the slope, multiple people heading our way. "How many?" I whispered. Thomas cocked his head, listening with the focus of someone trained to triage by sound alone. 3, maybe 4, moving slowly, not trying to hide their approach. We had perhaps 10 minutes before they arrived. Thomas and Marcus both looked to me for direction, and I felt the weight of that responsibility settle across my shoulders. Every decision from here forward affected more than just my own survival. "We meet them at the tree line," I decided. "All 3 of us, but spaced out. We look capable but not aggressive. Thomas, bring your medical kit. If they're in bad shape, we can help from a distance first. Marcus, you're injured, which actually helps. Shows we're not some militant group." The 3 men who emerged from the forest looked like they'd been through something that broke them in slow motion. The oldest, maybe 40, had the bearing of someone who'd held authority before the world ended, though his clothes were torn and his face was gaunt with hunger. A younger man, perhaps 30, moved with the careful precision of someone in constant pain, his left arm cradled against his chest in a way that suggested injury. Between them was a teenager who couldn't have been more than 16, his eyes holding that particular blankness that comes from witnessing horrors the mind can't process. The older man stopped when he saw us, raising his hands slowly to show they were empty. "We're not looking for trouble," he called out. "We're just trying to get to higher ground, away from the population centers. Saw you smoke yesterday." I kept my voice level, professional, using the tone I'd developed for de-escalating tense situations. "Where are you coming from?" "Started in Boulder," the older man said. "That was 3 weeks ago. Tried to head north first, but the outbreak spread faster than we could move. We've been in the mountains since. My name's David. This is Jensen," he indicated the injured man, "and Alex, The teenager didn't react to his name, just stared at something beyond us that only he could see. "You been exposed to infection?" Thomas called out, his medical training taking priority over social niceties. "Not that we know of," David replied. "We've been extremely careful about contact. Haven't seen another living person in 6 days until now." Thomas looked at me, and I understood the question in his eyes. I'd committed to not turning people away, but that was easier to say when it was hypothetical. These were 3 more mouths to feed, 3 more people to trust, 3 more variables in an equation that was already complex. But they were also 3 human beings in desperate need, and turning them away would mean probable death sentences. Comment below if you've ever had to make decisions where every choice carried weight you couldn't fully calculate. Share this with someone who understands that moral principles get tested hardest when resources are scarce. "We have a quarantine protocol," I said, making the decision and committing to it fully. "There's a space where you'll stay for 72 hours, separated from the main living areas. We'll provide food and water, but limited contact until we're sure you're healthy and we can all assess whether this situation works for everyone. Non-negotiable." David nodded immediately. "That's more than fair. More than we expected, honestly. We'll follow whatever rules you've established." Jensen, the injured one, spoke for the first time. "I've got a broken collarbone. Happened 4 days ago. Said it myself, but it's not healing right. If you've got someone with medical training, I'd be grateful for help even from a distance. I'm an EMT. I can look at it once you're through initial quarantine, see what can be done." We brought them up to the monastery, and I showed them the quarantine room Thomas and I had prepared that morning, as if we'd known it would be needed so soon. It was one of the smaller side chambers, maybe 12 feet square, with a window that could be opened for ventilation and a door that could be secured from the outside if necessary. Not comfortable, but shelter from the weather and infinitely better than another night exposed to the elements. Alex, the teenager, spoke his first words when he saw the room. "There's walls. Actual walls." His voice cracked on the words, and David put a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that spoke of care established over shared hardship. "You're safe here," I told them, and meant it as much as I could mean anything in a world where safety had become relative. "Rest. We'll bring food and water in a few hours." We left them there and returned to the main hall, where Marcus had kept the fire going. Thomas immediately started talking through the medical assessment he'd need to do on Jensen's collarbone. But I was watching Marcus, who'd gone quiet in a way that seemed different from his earlier focused silence. "You okay?" I asked him. He poked at the fire, not looking up. "That kid. Alex. He's got the look. The one that says he watched people die. Probably people he cared about." "You recognize it," I said gently. Not quite a question. "Yeah," Marcus finally looked up, his eyes haunted. "My girlfriend was with me when it started. We were camping with 2 other friends. When we tried to get back to campus, things were already falling apart. She got separated from us in the crowd. I looked for her for 2 days before giving up. I don't know if she made it." Thomas and I let the silence hold, giving Marcus space to say more or not. He'd shared more in that moment than in all the previous conversations combined, and pushing would only shut him down. "That kid's going to need someone who understands," Marcus finally continued. "Someone who doesn't need him to talk about it, but who gets it anyway." "You volunteering?" I asked. "Maybe. Once he's through quarantine, if he wants." Marcus went back to poking the fire, just saying surviving the physical part is only half the battle, the mental part is harder. He wasn't wrong. I'd spent my entire career dealing with the psychological aftermath of trauma, and I knew that untreated trauma didn't just linger, it festered and spread, poisoning everything around it. If we were building a community here, we'd need to address mental health as seriously as physical health and food security. The next 3 days established patterns that would define our community. We brought food and water to the quarantine room twice daily. Never enough to satisfy hunger, because we simply didn't have enough, but enough to sustain life. David used the time to rest and proved himself thoughtful during the brief conversations we had through the door. He'd been a high school teacher, philosophy and ethics, And even in isolation, he asked questions about our goals and principles, rather than just focusing on immediate survival. Jensen, despite his injury, started offering observations about the monastery's structure that showed expertise we desperately needed. He'd been a carpenter, specialized in restoration work on historic buildings, and even from quarantine he could identify issues with the roof and suggest repair solutions. Thomas examined his collarbone on day 2, from 6 feet away initially, then with permission for closer inspection, and confirmed it was healing poorly. He reset it, a process that involved Jensen biting down on a leather strap from his pack and sweating through pain that had to be excruciating, but he never made a sound beyond harsh breathing. Alex barely spoke. He ate what we brought, slept according to the patterns we observed through the window, but rarely engaged in conversation. On the second day, Marcus asked if he could sit outside the quarantine room and just talk, not to Alex specifically, not requiring responses. Just talk. I agreed, and Marcus spent an hour telling stories about his environmental science classes, about camping trips with friends, about nothing important and everything important. Alex never responded vocally, but Thomas noticed through the window that the kid's posture changed, becoming less rigid, more present. On day 4, we held the integration meeting. All 6 of us gathered in the main hall, David, Jensen, and Alex on one side of the fire, Thomas, Marcus, and me on the other. The physical separation felt necessary, a last acknowledgement of the quarantine period before we moved forward as a unified group, or decided this wouldn't work. We need to establish who we are and what we're building, I started, using my social worker voice, calm, authoritative, without being domineering, inviting participation. This isn't just a shelter. It's not a temporary camp. If we're doing this, we're creating a community, and that means shared values and agreed-upon principles. David leaned forward, his teacher instincts engaging. What values did you have in mind? We talked for 3 hours, and what emerged was something I hadn't fully anticipated. David pushed us to think beyond survival logistics toward questions of purpose and meaning. What separated us from the groups Connor had described forming at lower elevations, the ones built on dominance and resource hoarding. Why should anyone choose compassion over expedience when the world had gone to hell? Thomas argued for practical protocols, health standards, conflict resolution procedures, resource management systems. His years in emergency medicine had taught him that good intentions without structure failed in crisis situations. We needed rules, but the right kind of rules, ones that served the community rather than restricting it. Marcus brought a perspective none of us had fully considered: sustainability across time. If we were really building something long-term, we had to think in terms of seasons, years, maybe decades. Every decision had to account for regeneration, for maintaining resources rather than just consuming them. The gardens weren't just food sources, they were living systems we were stewarding. Jensen, even with his arm in the improvised sling Thomas had created, offered structural thinking. Buildings needed maintenance, or they failed. Communities needed similar maintenance, addressing small conflicts before they became fractures, repairing relationships before they broke, reinforcing the foundations constantly. His carpentry experience translated surprisingly well to social architecture. And Alex, who we'd thought wouldn't participate, finally spoke near the end. His voice was quiet, but steady. I just want this place to be different from out there. Everything outside became about fear. People stopped caring about anything except not dying. But that's not living. That's just slow death. Whatever we build here, it has to be about actually living, not just not dying. The words hung in the air like a mission statement we didn't know we needed. Out of the mouths of traumatized teenagers comes wisdom the rest of us miss because we're too busy calculating angles. We drafted what we called the foundation principles that night, and they evolved through debate and revision until everyone could honestly agree. This place exists to preserve not just lives, but humanity's capacity for compassion and reason. We reject the logic that survival requires abandoning morality. We will prove that communities can thrive on cooperation rather than domination. Everyone contributes according to their ability. No one carries more weight than they can bear. We acknowledge that ability fluctuates. Injury, illness, emotional crisis all temporarily reduce capacity, and that's acceptable. We support each other through those periods. Conflict will be addressed through dialogue, not violence. We've seen where violence leads. We commit to talking through disagreements even when it's difficult, to assuming good intent until proven otherwise, to finding solutions that don't require someone to lose for someone else to win. Isolation is our strength, but not at the cost of turning away those who need refuge. We will maintain security without becoming fortress-minded. New arrivals will be evaluated for compatibility with our values, not just their potential utility. What we build must be sustainable, environmentally, socially, psychologically. Every system we create should regenerate rather than deplete. This applies to gardens and firewood and food stores, but also to emotional energy and community trust and individual well-being. We will maintain hope without delusion, realism without despair. We acknowledge the world has changed catastrophically, but we refuse to accept that the only possible response is to become catastrophic ourselves. Looking back now, those principles sound almost naive. 6 men on a mountainside thinking they could create some kind of enlightened community while civilization burned below. But naive or not, those words gave us something to aim for beyond simple survival. They became our measuring stick for every decision that followed. The next weeks transformed the monastery from shelter into home. Jensen, once his collarbone stabilized enough for light work, assessed every structural element with the eye of someone who understood how buildings failed. He identified issues I'd missed, places where water infiltration would cause problems in spring, roof sections that needed immediate attention before heavy snow arrived, stones that had shifted and would eventually compromise walls if not addressed. "Whoever built this understood permanence," he said one afternoon, running his hands over the stonework with something approaching reverence. "These walls are 2 feet thick in places. The foundation ties directly into bedrock. The timber framing uses whole logs, jointed and pegged. This place was designed to outlast generations." He started planning repairs using materials we could harvest from the forest. We couldn't rebuild perfectly, but we could maintain what existed. He showed Marcus and me how to identify trees we could take without damaging the forest ecosystem. Dead standing timber, storm-damaged trees, specific species that regenerated quickly. Thomas learned alongside us, his medical precision translating well to careful carpentry. David established what he called evening forums, and they became crucial for maintaining our mental health. Every night after dinner, which was never enough but was shared equally, we'd gather around the fire and David would pose questions, not always practical ones about logistics, but deeper questions about ethics and meaning and who we wanted to be. What do we owe to people who might arrive sick or injured? How do we maintain individuality while building community? What parts of the old world are worth preserving versus what should we leave behind? The discussions sometimes got heated, but they forced us to examine our assumptions and actually define our shared values, rather than assuming we all meant the same thing when we used words like community and cooperation. Marcus transformed the gardens from wild overgrowth into actual food production systems. He identified 3 separate terraces where we could plant in spring, one for perennials, one for annuals, one for experimental crops where we could test what grew well at this elevation. He created a foraging map for the surrounding forest, marking locations of edible plants and their seasonal availability. The teenager Alex became his constant shadow, learning everything Marcus taught with the intensity of someone desperate for distraction from darker thoughts. The work seemed to help Alex in ways conversation couldn't. He rarely spoke, but he moved through the world with increasing presence rather than the ghostly absence he'd arrived with. When he did speak, his words were careful and considered, carrying weight precisely because they were rare. Marcus never pushed him to talk about what he'd survived, just gave him tasks and quiet companionship and the kind of acceptance that doesn't require explanation. Thomas kept us healthy through a combination of preventive protocols and limited medical interventions. He inventoried our collective medical supplies, painfully limited even pooling everyone's resources, and trained all of us in basic first aid. He established hygiene protocols that seemed excessive until he explained disease transmission in close quarters with limited medical resources. One serious infection could kill someone when antibiotics weren't available, so prevention became our primary medicine. He also monitored everyone's physical and mental state with the kind of attention that comes from years of emergency medicine. He noticed when someone wasn't eating enough, when exhaustion was becoming dangerous, when emotional stress was manifesting physically. He'd intervene quietly, adjusting work assignments, suggesting rest, occasionally just sitting with someone who needed presence more than solutions. My role evolved into something between manager and therapist, which made sense given my background. I coordinated work schedules, mediated conflicts, planned for long-term sustainability, and provided emotional support when people needed to process trauma they couldn't carry alone. The social work skills I'd developed over 7 years proved more valuable than I'd anticipated. Because people kept arriving. Month 2 brought Connor, the park ranger who appeared half dead from exposure and malnutrition. Thomas worked for 3 days to stabilize him, and we shared food we couldn't spare and burned firewood we'd have to replace. When Connor finally recovered enough to talk, he brought information from the wider world that confirmed our worst fears. Organized groups were forming at lower elevations, some focused on mutual aid and survival, others on control and exploitation. The worst of humanity was metastasizing in the power vacuum. "But you're doing something different here," Connor observed after his first week of full activity. He'd integrated quickly, bringing wilderness survival skills none of us fully possessed, and knowledge of the mountain range that proved immediately useful. "I can feel it. This place isn't just about survival. What are you actually building?" I looked around the main hall that evening. 7 men who'd been strangers now working together with shared purpose, eating a meal we'd collectively produced, warm and safe while chaos reigned below, and realized I finally had an answer that felt true. "We're building proof," I said, "that people can still choose compassion over fear, that community doesn't have to be about dominance hierarchies and resource hoarding. We're creating a space where the goal isn't just to survive the apocalypse, but to remain human through it, to preserve the best of what humanity can be rather than descending to the worst." David raised his cup of pine needle tea in a mock toast. No pressure then, just maintaining civilization's better nature while everything else burns. We all laughed, but beneath the humor was understanding. We'd stumbled into something rare and fragile. The question was whether we could maintain it as winter closed in and the challenges multiplied. Because winter came hard that year. Snow fell steadily through November, accumulating in drifts that reached the monastery's windows. Temperatures dropped to levels that made every breath hurt and every moment outside a calculated risk. We burned through firewood faster than anticipated, requiring constant expeditions to harvest more. Food became desperately scarce. The foraged resources that had sustained us through fall were buried under snow, leaving us dependent on stored potatoes, preserved berries, and the occasional successful hunt. Connor proved invaluable during this period. His knowledge of winter wilderness survival kept us alive through situations that would have killed us otherwise. He showed us how to insulate our sleeping spaces using pine boughs and snow. He taught us to read weather patterns in the clouds and wind, to recognize when storms were coming and when we had windows for critical outdoor work. He helped Marcus identify winter-edible plants buried under snow, roots and inner bark and frozen berries that provided crucial nutrition when nothing else was available. But winter also brought our first serious conflict. Hunger makes people irritable, and close quarters with no privacy amplifies every annoyance. A disagreement between Jensen and Marcus about firewood storage escalated into actual shouting, something we hadn't experienced before. Years of social work experience told me to address it immediately before it set precedent. I called everyone together and facilitated a conversation that felt uncomfortably formal for our small group, but necessary. Jensen felt his expertise on building management was being dismissed. Marcus felt his authority over resource management systems was being undermined. Both were right, and both were wrong, operating from places of stress and hunger and the constant low-level fear that came with winter's grip. We talked for 2 hours, working through the specific disagreement but also establishing broader conflict resolution protocols. Everyone needed to feel heard. Expertise should be respected but not treated as absolute authority. Disagreement was acceptable and even healthy, but contempt wasn't. We'd address problems directly rather than letting them simmer. The conversation was exhausting, but it cleared the air and established patterns for handling future conflicts. Week 12 brought our biggest test yet. A man arrived alone, appearing out of a blizzard like something from a ghost story. His name was Patrick, and he was in bad shape, frostbitten fingers, malnutrition, possible hypothermia, and something else that Thomas identified immediately as psychological trauma so severe it bordered on dissociation. Thomas stabilized him physically, but Patrick's mental state was more concerning. He spoke in fragments, his words disconnected from context. He'd seen something that broke him. That much was clear, but getting coherent details was impossible through the fog of trauma and physical distress. "We need to help him," Thomas said, "but I'll be honest, I don't know how. This is beyond my training." This was my territory. I'd worked with trauma survivors at every level of severity, from people having bad days to people whose minds had shattered under weight they couldn't carry. Patrick was toward the severe end of that spectrum, and treatment options in a world without therapists or medications were extremely limited. I sat with him for hours over the next days, not pushing for information but just providing presence. Let him talk when words came, let him sit in silence when they didn't. Slowly, fragments emerged. He'd been part of a larger group at a lower elevation. Something had happened. He couldn't or wouldn't specify what, that had ended with violence and deaths. He'd been running ever since, barely aware of direction or purpose beyond the need to escape. "You're safe here," I told him repeatedly, using the calm certainty that had worked with countless crisis intervention clients. "Nobody's chasing you. You're allowed to stop running." It took 3 weeks for Patrick to stabilize enough to function within our community. He'd probably never fully recover from whatever he'd experienced, but he found ways to contribute. He was meticulous about small tasks, organizing supplies, maintaining the fire, keeping common spaces clean. The repetitive work seemed to anchor him, providing structure when his internal world offered none. His presence changed our community in subtle ways. He was a visible reminder that the world beyond our walls was savage, that we'd created something precious and fragile, that needed protection. But he was also evidence that healing was possible, that even the severely traumatized could find purpose and stability given the right environment. Month 3 ended with 8 men living in the monastery, functioning as a community in ways that would have seemed impossible when I'd first discovered this place. We had conflicts and shortages and the constant grinding stress of winter survival, but we also had something rare, a shared commitment to remaining human in circumstances designed to strip humanity away. David summarized it one evening during forum time. Most communities throughout history were formed by proximity and necessity. People lived near each other because of resources or family or accidents of geography. We're something different. We're choosing this. Every day we choose to maintain these principles, to support each other, to build something better than simple survival. That choice is what makes this place matter. He wasn't wrong. We'd become something between family and intentional community and mutual aid society, bound together by shared trauma and shared hopes. The winter was far from over, spring remained a distant possibility, and we had no guarantees we'd survive until then. But we'd proven something important, that compassion could coexist with hardship, that cooperation could outperform competition, that humans could build systems based on care rather than fear. If you've made it this far into this story, you understand what we were fighting for wasn't just survival, but the soul of humanity itself. Like and subscribe if you believe that how we survive matters as much as whether we survive, because that distinction is everything. The spring we'd been desperately waiting for finally arrived in April. Though it came grudgingly, snow melted in fits and starts, revealing gardens we'd worried might not have survived the brutal winter. But Marcus's preparations proved sound. Most of the perennials had made it, and the terraces were ready for planting once the ground thawed enough to work. That spring planting became a ritual that defined our community's transition from survival mode to actually building toward a future. All 8 of us worked the terraces, following Marcus's directions but contributing our own observations and ideas. We planted potatoes and wild grain seeds we'd collected the previous fall. We divided and replanted the perennial vegetables that had spread. We created new beds using composted material from our winter waste and forest floor material Connor helped us identify. The work was backbreaking and hopeful in equal measure. Every seed we planted was a vote of confidence that we'd be here to harvest it, that summer would come, that the world would continue turning despite everything that had ended. Patrick, who'd barely spoken through most of winter, worked the soil with almost meditative focus. Alex, the teenager who'd arrived traumatized and silent, started pointing out plants and asking questions that showed he was learning and thinking and engaging with the world again. Thomas established what he called the health garden on one terrace, medicinal plants he identified or that Connor knew from wilderness first aid. We couldn't replace modern medicine, but we could cultivate alternatives. Yarrow for wound treatment, willow bark for pain and fever, mint for digestion, pine for vitamin C. It wasn't much, but it was something, and something was infinitely better than nothing. Jensen completed the greenhouse he'd been planning since late winter, using salvaged materials and incredible ingenuity. It wasn't large, maybe 8 feet by 12, but it was functional. The frame came from straight pine poles. The covering was a combination of scavenged plastic and improvised panels made from plant fibers Marcus had been processing. It wasn't pretty, but it extended our growing season by weeks on both ends, potentially making the difference between adequate food and starvation. Month 5 brought new arrivals, but this time it was different. A group of 4 men appeared one morning, but instead of stumbling up exhausted and desperate, they approached deliberately. They'd been watching us, they admitted, for 3 days, observing how we worked, how we interacted, whether we seemed stable or dangerous. Their leader, a man named Robert, was direct about their intentions. There are groups forming everywhere now. Some good, most bad. We've been looking for people who might be trying to build something sustainable rather than just taking from whoever's weaker. You seem like you might be those people. His honesty was disarming and concerning in equal measure. They'd been evaluating us like we were a potential investment or threat. But I also understood the pragmatism. Trust was expensive in this new world, and reconnaissance before commitment made sense. We went through our quarantine protocols, and during those 3 days we evaluated them as carefully as they'd evaluated us. Robert had been a professor of sustainable agriculture. His companions included a former wilderness guide, a man who'd worked in solar panel installation, and a quiet individual who turned out to have been a counselor specializing in PTSD treatment. That last one made me laugh when he finally revealed it on day 3 of quarantine. "We've been desperately needing someone with your skills," I told him through the door. "I've been doing crisis intervention, but PTSD treatment is beyond my training." His name was Graham, and he'd been running a veterans support group when everything collapsed. He'd seen the worst trauma could do to human minds, and he'd learned techniques for helping people process and integrate experiences that would otherwise destroy them. His presence meant Patrick might actually heal rather than just stabilize. It meant Alex and Marcus, and probably all of us, could process our own trauma more effectively. The solar panel installer, whose name was Vincent, walked around the monastery examining angles and possibilities. "The roof orientation isn't ideal," he said, "but we could definitely set up a small system. Not enough to power everything, but enough for critical functions. Lights, maybe a small refrigeration unit, communications equipment if we can find or build it." Connor, our park ranger, had been monitoring radio frequencies sporadically through winter when we could spare battery power. Most channels were silent, but occasionally voices emerged. Other survivors, other communities, fragments of the old world trying to reconstitute itself. Vincent's expertise might let us maintain contact with that emerging network, share information and resources, become part of something larger than just our isolated refuge. Robert's sustainable agriculture background complemented Marcus's environmental science training perfectly. They spent hours discussing soil amendment strategies, water management systems, polyculture planting schemes that would maximize nutrition while building soil health. The garden terraces that had seemed adequate suddenly looked like they had potential to actually thrive rather than just subsist. The wilderness guide, a weathered man named Frank, hit it off immediately with Connor. They spoke the same language of terrain and weather and the thousand subtle signs that told you what the land was saying if you knew how to listen. Together they expanded our foraging maps, identified new resources, and established routes through the surrounding mountains that would let us range further safely. We integrated the new arrivals carefully, establishing working relationships before assuming friendship, but within 2 weeks it felt like they'd always been here. 12 men now, functioning as a coordinated unit with complementary skills and shared values. Our evening forums grew more complex, addressing not just philosophy but practical governance questions. How do we make decisions? How do we handle serious violations of our principles? How do we maintain our values as we grow? Because growth seemed inevitable now. Word was spreading somehow through the survivor networks that there was a place in the high mountains where people were building something different. Month 6 brought 2 more arrivals. Month 7 brought 3. Each time we went through quarantine protocols, evaluated compatibility with our principles, integrated carefully, or in rare cases recognized that someone wasn't a good fit, and helped them move on with supplies and information about other groups that might suit them better. By month 8 we were 23 people. The monastery that had felt spacious for one person was crowded for 23, but Jensen had been planning expansions. We built additional structures using stone and timber, following the original building's design principles but creating separate spaces for different functions. A dedicated kitchen building with proper food storage, bunkhouse-style sleeping quarters that provided privacy while maintaining community, a workshop where repairs and construction could happen undercover. The work was constant and exhausting, but it was also purposeful in ways that fed the soul. We weren't just surviving, we were building something that might outlast us, creating infrastructure and systems and a community culture that could sustain itself across time. Graham, our PTSD counselor, established what he called integration circles, regular sessions where people could process trauma in a structured, supportive environment. Not everyone participated initially, but over time even the most reluctant found value in speaking difficult truths aloud and having them witnessed without judgment. Patrick made remarkable progress through these sessions. Alex, the teenager, started talking about what he'd lost and beginning to imagine what he might build. Month 9 arrived with the first anniversary of my initial discovery of this place. I stood at the spring one morning, watching water flow from the rocks the way it had for centuries, and took stock of what we'd created. 23 people functioning as a genuine community, gardens producing enough food that we weren't constantly hungry, infrastructure that would support us through another winter, a shared value system that had been tested and refined but remained fundamentally intact, and most importantly, a collective sense that we were part of something meaningful, preserving humanity's better nature in a world that had temporarily forgotten it was possible. The world beyond our mountains was still chaos. We knew that from the sporadic radio communications. Some areas were stabilizing under military control or local governance, but many remained lawless. The infection that had started everything was still active in population centers, though whether it was spreading or contained was impossible to determine from our isolation. But up here we'd created something different. A refuge not just from physical danger but from the logic of fear and scarcity that dominated everywhere else. We'd proven that people could choose cooperation over competition, compassion over cruelty, hope over despair. We'd become a proof of concept that different communities were possible. David captured it perfectly during our anniversary evening forum. We started as strangers seeking shelter. We became a community by choosing each day to maintain principles that most of the world has abandoned. That choice is the only thing that separates us from every other group out there. The moment we stopped choosing compassion, We become just another survival compound hoarding resources and fearing outsiders. But as long as we keep choosing, we remain something worth preserving. If this story has shown you anything, it's that humanity's better angels don't disappear during crisis. They just get harder to hear over the screaming of fear and desperation. We created a space where those better angels could still speak. Share this story with anyone who needs to remember that even in the darkest times, we get to choose who we become. Like and subscribe, because this isn't just a story about survival. It's evidence that the way we survive defines whether we deserve to. The monastery stands here still, walls solid, gardens growing, 23 people living proof that compassion isn't weakness and community isn't naive. We're not a utopia. We struggle and argue and sometimes fail at our own principles, but we keep choosing to try, and that choice is everything. The apocalypse tried to make us animals. We chose to remain human. That's the whole story.